Okay, so this is the first lecture on topic 6, cardiovascular system for advanced physiology. This is the second part of that lecture. And I want to do, so I ended the last part talking about the fact that it's kind of weird what's doing that for. Okay. Go away. Okay. So that the arterioles are kind of a bottleneck. So as blood's flowing into tissues from arteries, there's a lot of branches, sort of a lot of arteries for the blood to flow down, so you get kind of a parallel effect here, and the pressure doesn't drop much. But then as blood is entering into the tissues, the arterioles, there aren't a lot of arterioles actually. It's sort of the limiting sort of step in the system. Arterioles are the fewest in number, as we'll see, of anywhere in the system. So you get kind of a series effect where all the blood has to pass through arterioles, and arterioles become then the point that largely determines the overall resistance of the system. Okay, for this whole system, the arterioles, sort of the beginning of the branching into the tissues, is the point that determines is the main place that creates resistance in the cardiovascular system. And we'll kind of come back to that a little bit, comparing arterioles to capillaries, which are even narrower. So you might think it'd be capillaries, but it has to do with the fact that there just aren't many arterioles compared to a lot of capillaries. Something I didn't mention, though, not only are arterioles the point of the highest resistance in the system, but they arterioles and also basically the beginning points, the entry points to capillaries, have little rings of smooth muscle around them that can cause those vessels to constrict or dilate. So not only are they the point of the highest resistance, arterioles and then these precapillary sphincters here are the points of highest resistance, but they're also the point of regulation for resistance. So if you want to, when the body wants to increase blood flow into a capillary bed, so when the body wants to increase blood flow through, this bed of capillaries, where's my dang cursor? I keep losing. There we go. It can dilate, so it can relax these smooth muscles, cause them to dilate, and as we know, the resistance of a vessel, so know that Poiseuille's law, resistance is equal to, oh boy, I was hoping I could do it from memory, but 8 times nu times length times pi r4. And the key point here being the resistance goes with the fourth power of the radius, right? So if the radius decreases, then the resistance goes way down, and you can greatly increase blood flow through an arterial or precapillary sphincter by causing dilation, and conversely, constricting these muscles. So contraction of the smooth muscles cause constriction of the arterioles and precapillary sphincters, increased resistance, decreased blood flow. So we'll talk more about that in a bit. Okay, so that gives us a good idea of basically where resistance comes from in a vessel. Let's talk about pressure now. Let's think about where the pressure comes from. So we had our equation, sort of the fundamental equation for cardiovascular physiology, that mean arterial pressure is equal to cardiac output times total peripheral resistance. And we looked at sort of where resistance comes from in vessels. So how is pressure generated in the cardiovascular system? So as you can see, sort of the first thing we need to sort of think about is cardiac output. So regardless of what the vessels are doing, no matter what the resistance is, you won't get any pressure unless you have some cardiac output, unless the heart is ejecting some blood into the vascular system. So, and you may remember this from A&P2, what determines cardiac output, what determines how much blood the heart puts out. So cardiac output is usually measured in like milliliters per minute. And that, so that there are basically two factors at the heart, of the heart that determine cardiac output. So one is how fast the heart beats, so the heart rate, beats per minute. And then the second one is on each beat, how much does the heart squeeze out, and it's called stroke volume. That's milliliters per beat, right? And you can see that beats per minute times milliliters per beat will give you milliliters per minute, would give you the volume per minute that the heart ejects, for the heart to eject blood into the vascular system. So we're going to talk about, we're actually going to spend a fair amount of time on regulation of heart rate and stroke volume. Those are the big things that the heart does. I mean, the heart ejects blood out of the heart, right, into the vascular system. And it does so by squeezing a certain amount at a certain rate. Okay, so the blood is, the heart has squeezed blood out now, let's say, right? So you squeeze blood out on a single beat. But, where does the pressure come from? Why is it pressure, right? Why isn't it, we can picture the blood flowing, but where does the pressure come from? And what determines what that pressure is? And so to understand that, we need to think about injecting fluid into a vessel and basically what happens to the fluid when you do that. And the answer is that it depends on the nature of the vessel. So imagine that we had a rigid closed vessel, completely rigid, and you try to inject some fluid into there. Okay? So you put a syringe in, you start to inject some fluid, and let's say that it's already full of fluid. Let's say it's completely full of fluid. You put your syringe in, start to inject it. You cannot inject any fluid, basically. Even the tiniest push of the syringe will create basically an infinite increase, massive increase in the pressure. It just can't fit any more fluid. So basically you get no change in fluid, and for any tiny change in fluid, you get infinite change in pressure. Obviously these are sort of the theoretical case. There's no tube that's quite this rigid, but you can understand this idea, right? This tube would go, its pressure would go up infinitely because it's so rigid that it doesn't allow any volume to come in. At the opposite extreme, you can imagine a tube that was extremely stretchy, maybe even had holes in it. You inject some fluid into this tube, and the fluid goes in with no trouble. It has actually no. The tube doesn't really have offer any resistance to the incoming fluid, so you can inject as much fluid as you want, infinite fluid, and no increase in pressure. For a normal tube, what you get is something like this. So there's say you start with this sort of dotted outline here, then you inject some fluid into there, and the tube is somewhat stretchy. So it allows the fluid to come in, but as the fluid comes in, the pressure of the fluid in that vessel increases. So what physiologists do is they've devised a concept called compliance, and it's a measure of how kind of stretchy a tube is. And the way they measure it is for a given increase in volume, how much of an increase in pressure do you get? So if you can put a lot of volume in without much increase in pressure, you have high compliance. So big delta V or a small delta P is high compliance. So this would be, you know, infinite compliance, right? You put as much volume as you want, you don't get any increase in pressure. If you get a big increase in pressure for a small increase in volume, so small delta V, big delta P, you have low compliance, and so this would be the case of zero compliance. So no matter, even for the infinitesimal increase in volume, you get infinite increase in pressure. Very small number here, very big number there, so very small compliance. So small compliance, low compliance means rigid tube, high compliance means a very stretchy tube, and then, you know, real blood vessels are somewhere in between, right? So if it's a high compliance vessel, and so actually, and I think there's maybe a more useful way to express this equation. So let's say we want to say when we put in a certain volume of fluid, how much will the pressure go up? This is kind of the question we care about for the. That's what we're trying to figure out right now. When the heart ejects a certain volume of blood into the vascular system, how much does that make the pressure go up? And so let's rearrange this equation so we have delta P is equal to delta V divided by compliance. So we're saying if we give a certain volume, delta V, how much does delta P go up? And the answer is it depends on the compliance. If compliance is high, if this is a big number, then the increase in pressure is small. So high compliance, small delta P for a given delta V. So a stretchy vessel, a high compliance vessel, doesn't increase in pressure much. That makes sense, right? Low compliance means big delta P for given delta V. So if you have a low compliance vessel, you put some blood into it, and it's not going to stretch very much. Its pressure is going to go up a lot. And what you see is that one of the key differences between arteries and veins is in their compliance. So here we're looking at how much volume goes up for a certain amount of increase in pressure, and then this is for the aorta, and this is for the vena cava. So in the aorta, you know, as the pressure goes up and up and up, volume goes up and up and up, but not by that much. So this volume doesn't increase all that much. It takes actually a fair amount of pressure to get the volume to increase. Whereas for veins, tiny increases in pressure, big increases in volume, right? It just takes a little bit increase in pressure and whoosh, you get big stretching of the veins. So let's think about which one has higher compliance. Which one's more stretchy? So we said for the vein, just, you know, put a little bit of pressure into a vein and it expands greatly. So this has high compliance. Whereas the artery, the aorta, you know, you put a fair amount of pressure on it and it doesn't stretch all that much. Low compliance compared, at least compared to the vein, right? This does not increase in nearly as much as this does for the same amount of pressure increase. So arteries have significantly lower compliance than veins. So, of course, arteries are so the heart connects to arteries. So when the heart ejects blood, so let's say the heart squeezes on the blood, puts out a certain amount of volume of blood, you get a pretty big increase in pressure when you do that. You know, whereas if you squirt the same amount of blood into a vein, you wouldn't really, you know, let's say you go from 100 to 200, you get a pretty big increase in pressure, or you know, let's look, you know, whatever, 175 to 225, you know, you get a pretty big increase in pressure. Whereas 175 to 225 in a vein, it's like basically zero pressure for that whole range, right? So one of the big reasons you have pressure in your vascular system is that arteries have low compliance. So the heart squeezes blood into arteries, and the arteries squeeze back. They squish the blood. You're squirting blood into not a very stretchy vessel, and so they don't. If you squirted blood into a vein, all the pressure would be gone because the vein would just stretch out and fill up with blood. But arteries don't do that. They don't stretch very much. They keep the pressure on the blood high, and that's really important, right? Because going back to here or here, if you want to get blood to flow through a vessel, you have to keep the pressure on the blood high, because that's what motivates it to flow, right? If the heart pumped blood into a vessel and the vessel stretched and all the pressure was gone, there would be no flow. So this property, low compliance of the arteries, is really the key factor for why blood continues to flow through the system. Actually, but it can have downsides. Okay, so here we're looking at arterial. So basically, in arteries, we're looking at the increase in volume versus increase in pressure. So it's the same basic graph that we saw over here, volume versus pressure. So higher slope is higher compliance, right? So the veins have a high slope here, so they have high compliance. Arteries have lower slope, so lower compliance. What they've done here is they've taken sort of, I think, the large arteries. I don't know if this is the aorta or sort of like other large arteries, but these are large arteries of the body, and they've measured this curve of volume versus pressure in different age groups. So young, 20 to 24, and then as age groups go up, and what you see, right, is that these young people, their arteries are fairly compliant. The volume goes up a fair amount for increase as pressure increases. So they're pretty compliant, actually, relatively high compliance. You still get pretty big increases in pressure as volume goes up, but they're fairly stretchy. They're nice young, they're not too rigid. But as we age, our arteries get more and more rigid. The same volume creates more and more pressure as we get older. So this hardening of the arteries basically as we age is pretty much inevitable, and it's sort of the main reason why people are much more prone to have hypertension when they're older, and that can be very detrimental to the body. And it just comes down to the fact that our arteries change as we age; they become less compliant. When the heart ejects the same volume of blood, pressure goes up more, and we develop what's called hypertension. Okay, so the low compliance of the arteries in general is important for keeping blood flowing. But if your arteries are too rigid, or too non-compliant, it can make the pressure be too high, and that's not good for your body, for your vascular system. Okay. So that's sort of one of the consequences of the compliance of arteries, and one of the things that's sort of clinically relevant. For veins, so they have very high compliance. They're really stretchy, and one of the main consequences of that is that, so think about the heart sort of pumping some blood out, goes into the arteries, but the arteries have high pressure. They don't stretch very much, so the pressure is pretty high. The blood wants to keep flowing. Blood does not stay in the arteries for very long. It flows right out. The arteries don't store much blood. They actually, put high pressure on it to keep the blood flowing. And then the blood flows right through, through the arteries, flows through tissues, and then it arrives in the veins. And the veins are super stretchy. And it turns out that when the blood gets into the veins, it tends to kind of pool there. And so what you find is that about 60% of all the blood in the body is found in the systemic veins and the venules. So they're a relatively small fraction of the total system, but they're so stretchy that they can hold a large volume of blood. The veins act as kind of a blood storage pool. And that has some important consequences for some things we'll talk some about. Okay. So the compliance of the vessels has a lot of important consequences, right? About in terms of like the pressure on the blood and that and where the blood lives in the system. There's another important factor that actually has some pretty major consequences, but we're not going to talk a lot about it in this course. But I want to at least mention it. So one of the things that can really affect the pressure of the blood is gravity. So if we say that the heart is ejecting blood at 95 millimeters mercury. So if you look at someone who's lying down at different parts of their body, their feet versus their head, you know the arteries are going to have about the same pressure. So the blood's flowing through the arteries, and you know it's pretty much at the same pressure, because we said sort of how how as blood flows through the different arteries, it doesn't really change pressure very much. You know, as different branches come off, it doesn't have much effect on the pressure in the arteries because of the whole parallel flow concept. However, when someone's standing, so if this is the pressure of the blood as it comes out of the heart, what you see is that by the time the blood gets up to the head, it's at significantly lower pressure, whereas blood that's flowing down to the feet ends up being at almost 100 millimeters mercury higher pressure in the arteries than it was at the heart. So there's a big effect of gravity. Okay, this is just simply gravity, right? So you can imagine as the blood's flowing up, gravity, it's sort of working against gravity, and that causes the pressure to go down, whereas the blood flowing toward the feet is working with gravity, and there's blood down at the feet. It's kind of like water at the bottom of the pool, has a bunch of water on top of it, it's squishing it down and making it higher pressure. The blood in the feet has all this blood on top of it, it's kind of squishing it down, making it higher pressure. And so gravity can have some pretty important consequences for physiology, and you can imagine that big difference could have some major consequences. However, it's sort of too peripheral to the main story, so we're not going to talk a lot about it. So sorry about that. So one other really important factor, if we want to think about, so let's sort of follow the blood, and blood comes out of the heart, it's at a pretty high pressure, flows through the arteries, it's still at pretty high pressure. But what happens to the pressure as it flows through the arterioles, capillaries, veins, and then back to the heart? What happens to the pressure on the blood? And it has to do with, and the answer has to do with, this idea of sort of laminar flow as blood flows through a vessel. This central column of blood flows pretty fast and doesn't experience much friction. But the closer the blood is to the wall, the more friction it experiences with the wall of the vessel. And so you can imagine, sort of as blood is flowing through a vessel, some of the blood's kind of crashing into the wall and losing energy. And so what you find is that as blood flows through a vessel, the pressure goes from the higher value and then just progressively drops as it goes through the vessel. Okay, the pressure just as it goes through any vessel, pressure will drop. Now, a really wide vessel, has so much blood in the center that pressure drops very little. So for large diameter vessels, there's a small pressure drop as it flows through. But for narrow vessels, so much blood is close to the wall that you get a lot of sort of frictional loss of energy, and pressure can drop quite substantially through the narrow vessels. And so, so here's a graph that shows pressure of the blood, sort of in the left ventricle, aorta, arteries, capillaries, venules, veins, and then vena cava and right atrium. And you can see, so let's just kind of look at the systolic curve. It gets sort of pulsatile, goes with the pulsatile pressure of the heart in the beginning, but let's just follow the systolic curve. So, start off at 120 or 130, coming out of the ventricle, and then the pressure just progressively drops and drops and drops as it goes through the body. So, as it flows through the aorta and large arteries, it drops a significant amount, but not substantially. But then look at the arterioles, like from here to here. Huge drop in pressure, right? Arterioles are significantly narrower than the aorta is one big reason. And then the other reason, as we'll see, is that sorry, hold on a second. So the other reason that we'll talk about is that there really aren't, and I've kind of alluded to this, there just aren't nearly as many arterioles in general as there are arteries. So as the blood goes through the arterial part of the system, there just aren't nearly as many paths to flow through. So there's a big pressure drop. Okay, it's the biggest single drop in the system, and that's because, as we'll talk about in a bit, arterioles are the main site of resistance in the system, since the main site of the resistance, and so they're the site of the biggest pressure drop. And then you get some drop through capillaries, not as much as you might predict given how narrow capillaries are, but we'll talk about that in a bit. And then pressure's pretty low by the time you get into the veins, and back to the almost zero by the time you get back to the heart. And in fact, so we're saying that this pressure drop in the arterioles, this big pressure drop, is because the vessels are narrow, right? So they're high resistance. So one thing you might predict is that as arterioles constrict or dilate, that this curve will change shape. And sure enough, when arterioles constrict, what you see is that the pressure tends to be higher upstream. But then check this out. So this is a constricted arteriole from here to here, right? That's a huge drop. So when the arterioles constrict, then the radius becomes smaller, resistance goes up, the drop in pressure is huge. Compared to if arterioles dilate, you go from here to here, right? A much less difference than what you saw sort of over here. So that's in the dilated state, and that's the constricted state. And so this kind of illustrates the fact that control of the arteriolar radius is one of the most powerful tools the body has to control pressure and flow in the system. It's really the main tool for regulating pressure and flow in the body, is arteriolar constriction versus dilation. Okay? And in fact, we can actually get quantitative about this. So we're going to do this sort of thought experiment where we're going to say, look at the blood in the arteriole versus the capillary versus the venule, and so the blood's of course flowing this way through the system. We're going to say so we're going to look at the normal case, the case where arterioles dilate, or we can also so this would be the arteriole. It's between basically in the resistance of the arteriole. So we're going to look at the dilation of the arteriole. So less resistance here. You can also it's actually the same. You get the same effect by if you constrict the venule. But this isn't really. I'm not going to talk about that very much because it's not really used by the body very much. So we're going to look at the case of normal arteriole dilation. Or, let's skip the venule one again, or arterial constriction, okay? So here you can see the arteriole is much more, this is like a resistor, right? And so this is a much more resistant vessel. This is a less resistant vessel, and this is the normal vessel. So we're also going to, in this sort of little experiment, we're going to assume that the pressure starts as 60 when the blood kind of comes into the arteriole. In each case, we're going to assume that we're starting at 60 millimeters mercury. And our key question is going to be, how does constricting or dilating the arteriole, how does it change the pressure of the blood in the capillary? Because as we'll talk about in a bit, really the capillaries are the key part of the system as far as the exchange of materials. And exchange of materials is what the vascular system is all about. So we're gonna want to keep track when you change arteriolar resistance, make it less resistant by dilating it, or more resistant by constricting it. What does that do to the pressure in the capillary? And there's actually an equation. So if we want to determine what the capillary pressure is, the equation for that is a pretty simple one. So if this is R pre, it's the resistance of the arteriole, basically the resistance before the capillary. This is R post. It's the resistance after the capillary. What you find is that pressure in the capillary is equal to and then we're going to call this PA for arterial pressure, PV for venous pressure. And by the way, in this case, we're also going to have 15 millimeters mercury. Basically, we're going to say that pressure in the veins is the same each time as well. So this is a pretty normal case for looking at just like flow through one capillary bed, because the pressure, changes to the arterial in one capillary bed won't really change the pressure upstream or the pressure downstream. It'll just change the pressure through the capillary. Okay, so take my word for that. This is a reasonable assumption to make. So the equation is the pressure in the capillary is equal to R post over R tote times PA plus R pre times R divided by R tote times PV, where R tote is equal to the sum of R pre plus R post. Okay, well, whatever, right? What is blah blah blah? What does that equation mean? So what that's saying is that the pressure in the capillary will be equal to some fraction of the arterial pressure and some fraction of the venous pressure, and the idea is bigger R post or smaller R pre, P capillary is close to arterial pressure. So, and let's focus on the R pre case, right? Because we're saying we're mostly going to care about arterial pressure, the pressure in the resistance in the arterioles. If there's a small resistance in the arterioles, so say in the standard case you go from 60 down to 25 in the capillary, down to 15 in the veins. If you dilate the arterioles and make the pressure here go down, you're going to make the capillary pressure go up. Capillary pressure will be closer to the arterial pressure because there won't be as much pressure loss through this dilated arteriole, so the pressure will be relatively high here, closer to the arterial. Whereas, smaller, smaller R post, or more importantly, bigger R pre, so bigger arterial resistance. So capillary pressure is closer to PV. So when we increase the resistance of the arteriole, capillary pressure now goes from 60 to 20, right? So up here it was 25. When we increase the resistance here, it goes down to 20. So more arterial resistance, you could lose more pressure during the arterial lower pressure here in the capillary. And so let's sort of sum this up in very functional terms. Constrict arteriole leads to lower capillary pressure. Dilate arteriole leads to higher capillary pressure. And that's going to be really important. When we talk about, I mean, ultimately, the whole point of the cardiovascular system is get the flow through the capillaries so we can do exchange with tissues. Pressure on the blood in the capillary is going to be a vital factor in the exchange. We're going to kind of work through that as actually quantitatively. But that control of capillary pressure is a major factor in basically the body being able to regulate what the cardiovascular system does. And the main thing it does to regulate capillary pressure is to change arteriolar resistance. Okay. Constrict the arterioles, you make the resistance go up, pressure in the capillaries go down. Dilate arterioles, resistance goes down, pressure in the capillary goes up. Okay. And so there's going to be a PBL that we're going to work through this pretty carefully. All right. So for the last part of this lecture, I want to just sort of start talking about the different types of blood vessels and comparing them, their properties. Okay. So we'll do. So we'll start with what we call elastic arteries. These are the basically the really big arteries in the body, the aorta, and then the major branches of the aorta. And then we have medium arteries, arterioles. We'll talk about capillaries, and then veins, basically last. Okay, so starting with elastic arteries. Elastic arteries are have a large diameter, right? Average, aorta is a radius of 12 millimeters, so very large compared to even the next category of arteries, which are about 2 millimeters. So large diameter, and then the key property I think here is that they have a lot of elastic fibers in the wall. They have the most elastic fibers of any type of vessel. It actually gives them a little bit higher compliance, so they stretch a little more than the medium arteries do. But the big advantage of having this elastic wall is that it allows them to serve as what's called pressure reservoir, as a pressure reservoir. Pressure reservoir. So here's the idea. As blood flows in to the aorta from the heart, the pressure on the blood stretches the wall of the aorta expands. Then that's during systole, right? That's as the blood's actually getting pumped out. But then during diastole, blood's no longer getting pumped out of the heart. And, so if this was a totally rigid tube with zero compliance, flow would just stop, right? If you pump fluid into a rigid tube and then turn off the pump, flow stops. But if you have an elastic tube like this, so, as the blood was getting pumped into it, it was sort of expanding, absorbing some of that energy of that initial, that the pump was putting out. And then when the pump is turned off during diastole, the energy in the wall then starts to squeeze on the blood and creates pressure during diastole that wouldn't be there from the pumping of the heart, but its pressure is maintained during diastole, so you still get flow even though the heart isn't pumping, because the aorta kind of works like a tiny little heart. So the heart squeezes really hard and pushes blood out, and then the heart stops, and then the aorta squeezes the blood during diastole to continue the flow. And this diagram over here sort of shows you the example. So if you have if you have water under pressure and it's being released as in a pulsatile fashion, so you have pulsing pressure coming, through the supply tube, and then you look at a rigid tube versus a rubber tube that can expand and contract with elasticity. So if you look at flow through the rigid tube, you see what I was talking about before. The flow goes up as the pump, as the pressure in the pump is up, and then when the pressure in the pump goes down, the flow is gone. So the flow simply mimics the pressure in the pump. Flow, no flow, flow, no flow. And that's not great for a vascular system. We want there to be some blood flow all the time. So if you look at the flow through the tube that's got elasticity, you see that as pressure goes up, from the pump, the flow goes up. But when pressure is zero, flow continues, and so it's dropping. The elasticity is sort of squeezing the blood out, but it doesn't go all the way to zero, and it would eventually. But then you get another cycle of the pump squeezing some blood back into it, and then when the pump's not pumping, then the tube squeezes blood back out. So it maintains flow throughout the cycle of systole and diastole, and that's really important for the body. You can kind of see that if you look at the pressure through time in basically any artery. So this is the heart. This is the pressure of the heart squeezing blood out during systole, and then systole ends here. The aortic valve closes right here. And if the aorta were totally rigid, then then the pressure, then there would just be no flow. But you see that if you follow the pressure in the aorta, it kind of drops and drops and drops gradually over time. That's because the aorta is squeezing blood out sort of gradually. And you can see sort of all these curves, the thoracic artery, iliac, and femoral arteries all have this sort of gradually dropping pressure. That's because blood is sort of gradually being pumped through them during diastole primarily because of the elasticity of the aorta and the big elastic arteries. Okay. So that's how the elastic arteries work. Medium arteries have less elastic fibers. Basically, the basic story of these guys is that they have thick walls relative to their radius, and they're pretty just low compliance. They pretty much have constant resistance. They have smooth muscle, but it doesn't really constrict or dilate them very much. Not much, a little bit, but they don't really change their radius very much. They pretty much are constant resistance. Arterioles, so they have quite thick walls relative to their radius, and the main reason is because they have a lot of smooth muscle. For their size, and something I've kind of alluded to is that these are the main site of resistance in the cardiovascular system. And so you may have been thinking the whole time when I'm talking about this, well, let's look at capillaries. Capillary radius is a lot smaller, about 5 times smaller than arterial radius. And remember we said that resistance is equal to 8 nu L over pi r fourth. Apparently I memorized it now. So this has 5 times smaller radius, so it should have 5 to the 4th higher resistance than arterioles. Why aren't capillaries the highest side of resistance? And so here's the idea. If you look at an individual basis, an individual arteriole has radius of 15 microns, capillary radius of 4 microns. I think the number is slightly different than this table, right? Anyway, 3 versus 4, whatever. An individual arteriole has a radius of 15 times 10 to the 7th, blah, 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 unit. An individual capillary has 3,000 times 10 to the 7th, so an individual capillary is a lot more resistant than an individual arteriole. However, here's the key. How many total arterioles are there in the body? 10 to the 7th. How many total capillaries are there? 10 to the 10th. So 1,000 times more capillaries than arterioles. And so if you do the math, with the resistance in parallel versus series, what you find is that the total resistance that arterioles add to the body is 15 blah 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 units, and the total resistance that all the capillaries add is 3. So arterioles add about 5 times more resistance than capillaries do to the whole system. And that's basically just because there are a lot more capillaries than there are arterioles. Individual capillaries do indeed have more resistance than individual arterioles, but there are so many more capillaries than arterioles that in total the arterioles are the main site of resistance. Okay. Okay. Let's talk about capillaries a little bit. Oh, no. So the second thing about arterioles, and it's kind of related to that, so the fact that they have the most total resistance, and we've already sort of mentioned this, they also, they have all this smooth muscle in their wall, so they're the main site of regulation, and so you can look at the flow through an arteriole, and so when you look at arteriole with no sympathetic stimulation. So basically the main thing that activates vascular smooth muscle, as you hopefully remember from the previous, from the synaptic topic, is input from the sympathetic nervous system. There are little alpha-1 receptors on most of these guys that cause them to constrict. If you take all the sympathetic stimulation away, so as so pressure goes up, flow goes up fairly rapidly. So fairly low resistance. But the body can increase sympathetic activation. So as sympathetic activation goes up, the slope of that curve goes down. So with the same pressure, you get less flow at moderate sympathetic, and at high sympathetic activation, you get a lot of pressure to get a small amount of flow. So there's high resistance here. And it's this change of the resistance of an arteriole, and that is the main way that the body changes the flow. You can see how different the flow is when there's no sympathetic versus high sympathetic. Much more flow with when sympathetic is low than when sympathetic is high. And that's the main way the body regulates flow of blood through capillaries. Okay. So let's talk about capillaries a little bit. Obviously very narrow, but their walls are very, very narrow. And so the key concept of capillaries is that they are the main site, really the sole site, I should say, of exchange between blood and tissues. Okay? And that's, so, that's partly because just their walls are so thin, right? So delta x is small. And if you can think back to the Fick's law, that helps promote diffusion. But the other thing is that capillaries actually tend to have, so their walls are kind of non-continuous. So we have what's called continuous capillaries, where the cells meet up pretty closely. But even in capillaries like this, the cells, there's gaps between them. Okay, there's a significant gap. It's not like a tight junction. There's a quite a substantial gap between the endothelial cells of almost all capillaries. And so basically, water, ions, and most nutrients can just flow right through very easily. And some capillaries are actually even more porous. They're called fenestrated, and they have actually lots of big holes, and things just pass very, very easily through them. But pretty much all the capillaries in the body have narrow walls to promote diffusion and have spaces between the cells that make it so that most things can flow very easily. There are basically a couple places, the brain is one good example, where you actually do have very tight junctions between the cells, and so it's not much flows through. Sort of non-polar things can diffuse, things like gases, O2 and CO2, but actually most things don't. So that's the only exception, but really. But everywhere else in the body, the capillary wall is quite porous, quite good at promoting the exchange of materials in and out. Important aspect of regulation for capillary flow is that we talked about this a little bit already. So throughout the capillary bed, you find these little cuffs of muscle called precapillary sphincters. So you find them kind of at the entry point usually, or maybe the exit point of blood flowing between an arteriole and a venule. And these little precapillary sphincters can actually, at a very fine scale, regulate, like, which little tiny branches of these capillaries blood does and doesn't flow through. One of the interesting things about these precapillary sphincters that we'll talk about later, so the sympathetic nervous system is used to regulate arterioles, right? And the smooth muscle of arterioles. These precapillary sphincters, on the other hand, they do not receive sympathetic input at all. They are purely regulated by signals that come from the cells that live here. The little cells in the tissue release signals that go to the precapillary sphincters and tell them whether to constrict or dilate. So we'll talk about that. And I think I'm going to stop there. I'll start with the veins next time.